This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. I promise these are my own words and not plagiarized from anyone else.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything.
All jokes aside, I really have been thinking about this day for 2.5 years, and a product did come along that changed everything. I'm talking about transitioning to mirrorless cameras. I'm finally jumping on board and I couldn't be more excited. Hi everyone, welcome to another Tech Talk with Samir, where I talk about anything and everything related to technology in my life. If you haven't already, please check out some of my recent videos and subscribe to the channel to help me grow this thing. This is the Nikon Z6 II or Nikon Z6 II. Doesn't matter, just odd that out of the entire alphabet, Nikon decided to choose the one letter that has different pronunciation depending on what part of the world you're in. But regardless of your pronunciation, you'll experience the same amount of awesomeness when it comes to this camera. Now, before I go on, I just want to make it clear, this isn't a comprehensive review of this product. There are plenty of people who are way more qualified than I am that has already done comprehensive reviews about this. This is just an initial impressions video where I share my perspective coming from being a DSLR user up until now. I just want to share some thoughts that you may also want to think about if you're on the fence about switching to mirrorless. Ever since I got my first DSLR 11 years ago, I have been obsessed with photography and camera gear. I started off with a Nikon D5000, and after it died within 2 weeks of using it, I exchanged it for an upgraded model, the Nikon D90. What I didn't realize at the time was that this seemingly harmless upgrade would become a pattern over time when it came to camera gear. I would buy something, then something newer and better comes out, and I would want that too. That being said, this pattern mostly applied to lenses and other accessories. When it came to camera bodies, after my D90, I only upgraded once in the last 11 years. That was when I bought my Nikon D750. For the last 6 years, the D750 has been an absolute workhorse for me, and there's no slowing down in sight. It's been my favorite camera for photography ever since I got it. I've shot countless events and portrait sessions with it. That being said, over the last few years, the rise of mirrorless cameras have been very intriguing to me. Seeing how good the Sony mirrorless cameras have been actually made me a little envious of Sony users. As much as I would have just loved to jump on the Sony bandwagon, I was already way too invested into Nikon gear. Over the years, I've accumulated many high-end Nikon lenses and accessories, and it was going to be really difficult to sell everything and switch to another camera ecosystem. So I ended up doing what most Nikon users did and wait for them to come out with a mirrorless camera. In 2018, when it finally became clear that Nikon was going to announce mirrorless cameras, I was very excited to see what Nikon had in store. When the Z6 and Z7 were revealed along with the FTZ adapter, I was very much relieved to know that I could still use my older Nikon lenses with the new cameras. However, the original Z6 and Z7 had a couple of flaws which were a bit of a deal breaker for me. Mainly it was the lack of dual card slots. Yes, I know that XQD and CF Express cards are very reliable, but when it comes to covering events for clients, it's a risk that's just not worth taking. The technology on the cards can be very reliable, but there's always a chance of human error, like accidentally formatting a card without backing it up. On my D750, I have always used the redundant cards to ensure I have 2 copies of every photo I take. So switching to a camera with only 1 card slot would actually be a bit of a downgrade for me. One of the main things from Sony cameras that I was really envious of was the autofocus system while shooting video. If you've ever tried doing video work using older Nikon DSLRs, autofocus has been absolutely useless in live view. I knew their mirrorless cameras would have to be much better because live view is the only view when it comes to mirrorless cameras, so it has to perform at least comparatively similar to the competition for them to even come out with it. At launch, despite being drastically better than the DSLRs, the Z6 and Z7's autofocus still lacked quite a bit. Over the last 2 years and multiple iterations of firmware upgrades, autofocus on those cameras have become significantly better according to reviews I've seen, but at this point I was already convinced I was going to wait for the second generation of these cameras. With the Z6 II, the wait has finally come to an end. That brings me to today. I pre-ordered this as soon as it was announced and it just arrived last week. At the time of making this video, certain retailers have a bundle where they're including an FTZ adapter, which normally costs $200, for free if you purchase the Nikon Z6 II. This was an attractive deal for me because I would have had to buy the adapter anyways to use all my existing lenses. Inside the box, you get a battery, a charger, an USB-C cable, cable, a camera strap, and the camera body itself, along with a bunch of manuals and other papers that I'll never ever open. Coming from a Nikon DSLR background, the Z6 II has a very familiar feel in my hands. Although definitely smaller, it still feels very comfortable to hold. Having used the D750 for the last 6 years, the button placements also feel mostly familiar. With the exception of some of the buttons being relocated, the transition to the Z6 II should be fairly seamless when it comes to getting used to where things are. Perhaps the biggest change that I will have to get used to is the electronic viewfinder. Coming from a DSLR, I've been used to having an optical viewfinder with no latency. An electronic viewfinder is essentially having a small live view screen inside the viewfinder. This new type of viewfinder also comes with its set of advantages. Being able to see the exposure in real time rather than having to take a test shot before adjusting is one of the things I'm really looking forward to. And it finally has dual card slots. With a caveat, the two card slots are actually two different types. One of them is a CF Express slot and the other one is a regular SD slot. I'm probably going to make a lot of people mad by saying this, but I wish it had dual SD card slots rather than one of them being CF Express. I mean, have you seen the price of CF Express cards? I know it's supposed to be exponentially faster than SD cards, but it's insane. They cost way more than even high-end solid state drives for computers. As a result, for the time being, I'm actually only using a single SD card until I book some events for clients. Also, another thing to note is that even if you were to have two cards in there, you can only use the redundancy for photos. When it comes to shooting videos, it will still only record to one card, which isn't a big deal for me because I just do videos like this one for my YouTube channel. I don't do video work for clients. Not to mention, previous Nikon cameras also had this limitation, so for me, it wasn't exactly a downgrade in this regard. Another thing to note is that although the new battery for this camera looks identical, it has some new features. This new battery allows you to charge it with a USB-C cable while it is being used. This can be handy in certain situations. This battery also comes with slightly higher capacity, which is always a good thing. Just because it comes with this new battery, it doesn't mean that it's the only battery that can be used with this camera. The camera can still operate with the batteries from my D750. This is great for someone like me who has accumulated batteries over the years and they don't just all of a sudden become obsolete. You may be wondering why I waited for this camera. Why couldn't I just switch to either Sony or Canon instead of waiting to transition to Nikon Mirrorless? And the key word there is transition. If I were to switch to Sony or Canon, I would have to start from scratch and get all new lenses and accessories right off the bat. Whereas with Nikon, I can take the slow route and slowly transition given majority of my lenses and accessories will still be compatible. And the key to this compatibility is the FTZ adapter. This is the adapter that will allow me to mount my existing Nikon lenses to the new camera. One of the biggest physical changes to the Nikon Z series cameras is that the new cameras have a new lens mount. They call it the Z mount. It's a much bigger mount compared to their older F mount, which has been on their DSLRs and film cameras for decades. This change will allow for Nikon to come up with lenses that were previously impossible for their F mount, like the $8,000 manual focus 58mm f 0.95 NOC lens. Really, Nikon? This is the lens you come up with to show off your fancy new mount? Something that's out of reach for a majority of the people out there? Anyways, that's a different rant that I don't want to get into in this video. Going back to the FTZ adapter, you simply just mount one end of it to the camera and you mount your F-mount lenses to the other end. This will allow me to use my extensive collection of F-mount lenses with the new camera. According to reviews I've seen, as well as my initial testing, F-mount lenses perform very well with this adapter. Some of the third-party lenses may require a firmware upgrade in order for them to become compatible, but at least the option is there for the most part. Now, although I'm a part-time professional photographer, one of the biggest reasons why I decided to upgrade to this camera is because I'm doing a lot more video work lately. And as I mentioned earlier, doing video work using older Nikon DSLRs is not exactly ideal, particularly due to the lack of reliable autofocus. It's slow to acquire focus, virtually incapable of tracking subjects, and just a pain to work with. The Nikon Z6 II seems to have finally made video on Nikon cameras actually practical. Based on my initial testing, it's great at acquiring focus and then also great at tracking the subject. And new to the Nikon Z6 II is eye detect autofocus while recording video. It will detect and track the eyes of both humans and animals when the subject gets close enough. Canon and Sony users are probably seeing this and saying, that's cute. I've seen reviews of Sony and Canon mirrorless cameras, and I'm very much aware how much better those are when it comes to autofocus. But going from a Nikon DSLR DSLR to this type of autofocus in video is literally a night and day difference for me. I took this camera out to test out the autofocus and I was very pleased with the results. I tested in some very challenging lighting conditions in a museum and I was able to detect and track my wife's eyes even with a mask on. I would have never been able to get shots like this with my DSLR because I would have had to manually focus and it would have been impossible to keep it locked in as she was moving towards the camera. Even though I'm using adapted lenses, the autofocus still works amazingly well. The only thing I noticed is that the f-mount lenses are relatively noisy when focusing, so if you're not using an external microphone, you may be picking up a lot of focus motor noise. Given how well even the adapted lenses work, I can only imagine how well the native Z-mount lenses perform when it comes to autofocus. Another cool new feature this camera has is in-body image stabilization, also known as IBIS. This is awesome because my most used lens is the Nikon 24-70 f 2.8G lens, and that lens itself doesn't have vibration reduction. However, once I put that lens on this camera, I get image stabilization right away. This can be very handy for video as handheld shots are much more stable than my D750. Amongst the many familiar things about this camera coming from the D750 is one that I wish wasn't as familiar. It's the tilting mechanism of the screen. Seeing Canon and Sony come out with amazing cameras with flip out screens, I was really hoping that Nikon would adopt the same design and give us a flip out screen. Generally for photography, the tilting screen is fine and I've used it countless times to get angles that would be otherwise hard to get. However, ever since I started making videos for this channel, I have been wishing that there was an easy way to see myself to better frame the shot. When you're making YouTube videos like this, you're pretty much a one-man show, and not being able to see what is being recorded is a bit of a bummer. Of course, you can always connect a screen using an HDMI cable like I'm doing here, but it would be much easier if there was a flip out screen. I guess I'll just have to live with it for now. This camera can shoot up to 4K videos at 30 frames per second, and there will supposedly be a firmware upgrade in early 2021 to enable 4K at 60 frames per second. Although apparently when that happens, it will crop the video a bit to accommodate for the higher frame rate. As you may have noticed, all my videos till now have been 1080p. This was partially because my D750 was only capable of shooting up to 1080p. Now that I have a camera that's capable of 4K, I will slowly be transitioning to shooting at 4K in the coming weeks. There's a few more pieces for the 4K puzzle for me to make it work, so stay tuned for some of my upcoming videos for that. When it comes to photography with this camera, I haven't done too many tests with it just yet. I haven't yet taken it out on any shoots for clients. During this pandemic, I have been doing very limited photography work for clients to minimize interactions with too many people. So actual real-world testing of photography features will likely have to wait until the world is a normal place again. I did try out the eye detect autofocus for some portraits and it worked great. If the subject gets close enough, it will automatically detect the eye and just track it, regardless of any movements. I just haven't had the chance to fully put it through its paces. I have always been someone who uses single point autofocus and combine it with focus and recompose techniques to get the right framing. Switching over to eye and face detect autofocus will definitely take some getting used to, but it's a change that I'm really looking forward to making. To be honest, I had no complaints about the D750 when it came to quality of the photos, and so far I can say the same about the Z6 too. Now, since Adobe Lightroom doesn't yet have the capability to natively read the RAW files from this camera, I want to reserve my final judgment for later. However, just from seeing the JPEG files, I can tell that this will at the very least be at the same level of quality as my D750, and I expect it to further exceed it, since 6 years is a long time when it comes to improvements in technology. The 24 megapixel sensor is the perfect resolution for covering weddings and other fast-paced events. Typically, after covering an event, I come home with several thousand photos to dump onto my hard drive. 24 megapixel RAW photos are the perfect balance when it comes to the file size. That's part of the reason why I was looking for the Z6 line rather than the Z7, as I did back in the day with the D750 rather than the D810. High megapixel is great for specific situations, but when it comes to high volume photography, 24 megapixel would be what I would consider ideal. Having lower amount of pixels also gives the Z6 another advantage. It is capable of shooting at up to 14 frames per second, which is much faster than the Z7. Assuming the autofocus can keep up, it would be perfect for capturing action shots. So what's next when it comes to this transition to mirrorless? To be honest, I don't fully know just yet. I will still be keeping my D750 as my secondary camera for events. I generally carry two cameras when covering large events to avoid having to change lenses too often. As a result, I can't get rid of my f-mount lenses just yet, and getting z-mount lenses would mean that I could only use it on one camera, since z-mount lenses aren't backwards compatible with the f-mount. Thanks to the FTZ adapter, at least I can continue to use my f-mount lenses on the new camera, for the most part. When I said that I can use all my f-mount lenses with the adapter, that's not 100% true. I have a Tokina 100mm macro lens which doesn't have a built-in autofocus motor, and it relies on a built-in motor on the camera itself. Nikon's mirrorless cameras do not have that built-in motor, so I can no longer autofocus with it. In addition, I have a first generation Tamron 15-30mm f2.8 ultra-wide lens. Now, it recently got support for the FTZ adapter, but it requires a firmware upgrade which can only be done by Tamron. I bought that lens used, so when I've called Tamron to get the firmware updated, they keep sending me in a circle to call their Canadian service center, and when I call them, they say that since I'm in the US, they cannot do it for me. Come on Tamron, help me out here. So that's another one of my important lenses which will not work with this new camera for the moment. So that puts me in a position where I cannot just abandon my DSLR lenses and move straight to mirrorless just yet. But as newer and better lenses and gear come out down the road, I'm sure the transition will slowly continue. Overall, I'm very excited to be using this camera going forward. This is a big change compared to what I've been used to for the last 11 years. I hope to make an update video down the road after I've spent some quality time with this camera. At the very least, I'm hoping that I'll be able to make higher quality videos using this for the channel going forward. One final thing to remember is that your camera gear is essentially just a set of tools. It should never dictate the actual content. Your creativity should always dictate the content. The innovation in the tools just makes it easier to achieve certain things. It's very easy to get caught up in a pattern of having the latest and greatest tools, but having the tools isn't necessarily going to result in having a better end product. A great canvas and a paintbrush isn't what makes the best paintings. It's the artist who puts it all together to make something beautiful. Once again, if you haven't already, please hit the thumbs up button on this video and consider subscribing to this channel. I'm still getting used to talking in front of a camera, so bear with me as I learn and become more comfortable going forward. As always, I'll be putting Amazon affiliate links to some of the items I've mentioned in this video in the description. If you choose to buy anything using those links, I'll get a small commission from Amazon, which helps me bring more content to you guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you come back to check out the next one.